McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and the program this week is all about universities and how important they are, or how big a problem they may be in some communities. Jim, why don't you introduce our first guest and give us just a bold perspective on the topic?
I sure will. Thank you, Dennis. So we've learned that universities play an outside role in America's cities. They may bring, of course, economic development, diverse ideas, people together, and they also generate new innovations. Their growth can also, though, lead to sprawling campuses that swallow neighborhoods and in some cases, even entire towns, leaving in their wake displaced residents, high walls, and sometimes increased friction between town and gown. Dennis, as you know, we really didn't know a lot about this issue, but we now know just how complex and challenging it is. And to bring different perspectives, we're joined by two guests. Let me introduce Davarian Baldwin. He's the Paul E. Reither Distinguished Professor of American Studies, as well as the founding director of the Smart Cities Research Lab at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And he's the author of a book that'll be coming out in March, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. Dennis, turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. Davarian, thank you for joining us. And also, I'm going to introduce our other guest, who is Cal Jamison. He is the Vice President for Facilities and Economic Development at the University of Texas at Dallas, which happens to be located in Richardson, Texas. And full disclosure, I retired last May as with 10 years on the faculty as a clinical professor of corporate governance at UTD. Cal has led about $2 billion in economic development since he's been at the university. And Cal, why don't you give us some sense of why you would say that particularly UTD is a great asset to Richardson and the Metroplex here in the Dallas area?
Sure. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you to all of you for being a part of this program. UT Dallas has basically evolved as a campus that once was a community college. And one of the things we've established very early in the process was the importance of having a strong town and gown relationship. So you got to have a relationship with the respective jurisdiction. So in that regard, since I've been here and I came in 2007, we've grown from some 14,000 students to almost 29,500 students, added almost $2 billion in new development and 14 million square feet to the campus. And as we've done that, the surrounding communities, Cottonwood Creek, Canyon Creek, etc., all were invited to be a part of the campus environment. Programs on campus, making sure they're an important part of what we do overall. So from that aspect of it, we're a big talent pool for the community. We know that every year we're going to add at least $500 million in development back to the city of Richardson. And for the Metroplex, we add some, our economic impact is some $13 billion when we look at the entire complex itself, and then you can look at the state of Texas itself. We are a large entity when it comes to producing a talent pool. So businesses who want to move to the region, they look at where is your talent pool, and UT Dallas is producing some of the brightest kids in the country every year, average SAT score. And some of the tops in the state of Texas every year. So all of that adds to the pluses that we bring to the table.
Yeah, Jim, you've heard the great story here at UTD.
And indeed, you know, having lived in Dallas now for over 20 years, it's been remarkable to watch the growth at the University of Texas at Dallas. But Dr. Baldwin, you really see in some ways, you've had a different experience, especially in your community.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I don't know the story of UTD in particular, but I in no way doubt what Dr. Jamison is laying out in terms of the economic impact and benefit of UTD within the immediate community. However, many times we have universities placing or putting out a kind of benefit statement about economic impact, but that kind of statement needs to be parsed and detailed a little bit more fervently in terms of economic impact for whom. We know that the kinds of developments, the research and development, the building of university expansion has an immediate impact economically on the investor class, on university administrators, on shareholders, and on municipal leaders. But my concern or my focus has been on those long-standing communities, especially working class neighborhoods and communities of color that largely surround urban campuses. What has been the impact of university development and growth on those communities? And when we look at those communities, the results are extremely mixed. As universities expand into these neighborhoods with their innovation districts or research parks or knowledge communities, housing prices go up, property taxes go up, and individuals in those communities, usually of fixed income, are struggling to remain as economic impact washes over these neighborhoods. And sometimes they are displaced, or sometimes a larger portion of their budget is taken up by housing costs. Many of these individuals also come, as Dr. Jamison pointed out, they might come to work on campus. We talk about faculty and we talk about researchers, but the actual engine of universities are the low-wage workers in the food service or the groundskeepers.
But
and their conditions.
For a minute.
Yeah.
Aren't they in many cases improving the neighborhoods? I mean, aren't these often neighborhoods that, to use a term that you use in your book, that are blight, neighborhood blight?
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. The neighborhoods are improved, but the question becomes, for whom? Are they improved in a way that targets those who universities and municipal leaders want to come into the neighborhood? Are they improved for the existing residents? My research has shown that the neighborhoods are improved for a targeted or an imagined new arrival of new residents in terms of the kinds of consumer tastes, the kinds of price points for housing are usually targeted for those who they want to come and not for those who want to remain, who come from more modest backgrounds. The new developments aren't necessarily meant for those who are already there.
Yeah, Davarian, you make a compelling case in your book, but give that viewer an idea of a couple of examples, and maybe start with Yale, because Cal is very familiar with Yale, and we've all been there, et cetera. So give us an idea of something just down the street from you.
Sure. So, for example, right in the height of the pandemic, a number of individuals, activists and residents, and even some workers at Yale instigated a 600-car protest called Yale Pay Your Fair Share, because as the university has expanded and almost $2.4 billion in properties around New Haven, most of those properties are tax exempt because they are tied to an educational institution. Now, what happens because these properties tax exempt? Well, the money that would normally go to the municipal budget to pay for things like public schools, roads, the electrical grid, things that snow removal, trash removal, there's no money from the university, which is the biggest employer, the biggest economic entity in the city of New Haven. The money that would normally go to that city doesn't go there. And so there's a direct correlation between the ballooning endowment and wealth of Yale and the struggling municipal conditions of New Haven.
But aren't tax incentives often given by the city?
Yes, they are. But again, that's the difference between the municipal leadership and the the tax incentives the tax abatement is given by the state,
right? And
that's different. So for example, in New Haven right now, the mayor of New Haven is actually asking for Yale to put in what's being called a pilot, payments in lieu of taxes.
Yeah,
right. And so these actually our state earmarks. And in the case of Yale, their tax exemption goes back to before the U.S. was a country, because it's one of the oldest universities in the world. And so this disparity is stark.
Yeah, and Cal, you sort of understand some of the things he's saying. So weigh in.
Yeah. So I concur with what Davarian is saying about how things are managed in different jurisdictions. Let me explain some uniqueness of where we are here. We're in an urban environment at UT Dallas where the town-county relationship is important. And we add to the value of everything that they do from perspective of being an economic engine, but also as a result of the campus being here, property, housing prices have gone up, et cetera. But we're careful not to infringe upon the community. We own land to the south, to the north, and then land to the east, and then the campus is to the campus to the east of us, to the north and to the west. But so we don't infringe, and for that reason, we engage them in the process of what we're doing. That's one. But to speak to his point, Dr. Baldwin's point, here's the thing to keep in mind. I was a former city manager in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, whereas here I've got a mayor and who's at Richardson, Mayor Volker, Dr. Benson, our president here, all a strong town-county relationship. City manager, all of us work close together. So we talk about ways in which we can support each other. In fact, they actually put us in a bond package to do a loop road inside the campus. That's what they did. Now, when I was, and then we helped them in terms of other things we do overall. We planted, I planted over almost 8,000 trees since I've been here, those kinds of things. So we've helped that process and invited people in. Now, in your scenario, Yale is similar to Richmond. And in Richmond was a state capital environment, urban environment itself. And we every time Virginia Commonwealth University used to expand, they would go off the tax roll. So what I would do, and at that time, I was on the other side of it. I was a city manager, right, the municipal person. So I would say, okay, I need some pilot dollars, payment in lieu of taxes. Mm-hmm. How am I going to get that? So some of the buildings that you took offline, you would then build through a foundation and you paid money back to the city. Why? Because there were fire services we needed. We didn't shovel as much snow in Richmond as you guys are shoveling up there.
Right.
But we also had all kinds of services, and it grew. It grew up to 30,000. I think now it's probably 35,000. So, and then the surrounding communities, they were encroaching upon some of the particularly African American communities that were there. Well, they had to pay top dollar to get those houses if they were doing that. But we also asked them to make sure that they do some things to help that community overall. And so they had ways in which they invited the community back on campus as well. We used that to put in a performing arts center right on Broad Street.
Well, Cal, that's because you're such a good diplomat and we're a good city manager, but I don't think that's always the case. How can cities, in your experience and your research, respond? I know you've talked about community benefit agreements.
Yes.
Tell our viewers how that works. And again, we're talking about very different situations here in Dallas with University of Texas versus some of the examples in your research.
Well, first, let me be just clear. So I know that it might come to the assumption that, well, we're just talking about elite New England universities, Yale, Princeton, Harvard. But this is something that's also going on at public schools like University of Virginia and Arizona State University, where today's economy is a knowledge economy. And at the center of that knowledge economy is using academic research to build profitable goods and patents that can be brought to market in a number of fields, from pharmaceuticals to military defense weaponry, to software products. And so universities are at the center of that. A lot of this work is happening on tax-exempt land. And this is happening in Arizona at a public school. And so in the face of that, you have activists and residents in the communities that are asking for things like community benefits agreements, so that if you expand or build in our neighborhoods, you will have to you pay a pilot. But again, pilots are voluntary because all institutions of higher education at any time can opt out of that when they feel like it. And so again, it's about managing these relationships that Dr. Jamison talked about. That's very much so appreciated, but they are voluntary. But there also, all solutions are things like a community-based planning board, that if you plan or extend into a neighborhood, there must be community-based oversight over the terms of that expansion. There also are things like in Chicago with Obama's library, they're talking about a affordable housing land trust, so that even though the building might not displace communities, as the building of campuses go on, the property values that surround the campus go up. And these neighborhoods that are in fixed incomes cannot keep up with that rising property value. So what's happening is they're proposing a community-based affordable housing land trust, so that when property values do go up, then these individuals can pull from that land trust to compensate for their fixed income, so they can stay in the neighborhood as property values rise. So again, these are solutions, but they aren't coming from the universities. And that's the important point to note. Maybe not in the case of UT Dallas, but in most major cities across the country, these solutions are coming from city managers or activists or community residents, sometimes in the form of a lawsuit. At Princeton, in 5 years ago, there was a lawsuit because residents saw that these tax-exempt buildings were producing millions in royalties for Princeton, but the historically Black neighborhood of Weatherspoon Jackson their property values were going up, and they had no recourse but to go to the courts. And they won a case.
Yeah, Davarian, that's a good point. And Cal, let me ask you to explain to that viewer a couple of things. That Davarian's made a good point here about taxes and tax benefits. I would assume that because University of Texas at Dallas is obviously a state school, that they would get tax exemptions. I'm talking about property tax exemptions now, which is where the big money is, I think. But I think you went to Virginia Tech. I guess that's a state school as well, but how do private schools get property tax exemptions, or is it just this thing where the city says, we'll give you this? I mean, looks to me like that's a disconnect between private and public. Am I missing something there?
I don't think you are. It depends, and I can't speak totally to how that process worked at many private institutions, but what normally happens, and it depends on jurisdiction in terms of what transpires. Somewhere in this process, that private school is paying some money to that respective jurisdiction in some capacity or the other. They're not just taking over the land itself, either in that pilot or either they've had some kind of partnership attached to them overall. So that process does work, but I think he hit a real good point here. And I'm gonna give you something that we did. The way we make sure that someone pays, we have land that we own. So we develop what I call as a college town. We're the comet. So I want to develop a college town adjacent to the campus. So we lease the land to a developer. When we lease the land to the developer, at that particular time, that developer, that land at that point, that developer now has to pay taxes to the city. Okay. And so for that reason, that's revenue going to the city that's going to help the community as a part of the process. Now, the fact that there isn't a trust in many communities is the problem, because there's no relationship. Sometimes, and you mentioned Charlottesville, my Wahoo that's on the thing as well. Charlottesville.
I'm right here, a good Cavalier. Right
there. I'm just saying, now Charlottesville grew fast, but the challenge Charlottesville has, and I'll use Blacksburg. If Tech disappeared from Blacksburg, it'd be a ghost town. If Charlottesville left, if UVA left Charlottesville, it'll be almost similar. But the difference is that the relationship, the town-county relationships, you have to find a way to connect the two. Unfortunately, in many cases, there isn't always that good board that he's articulating that pulls people together, says, here's what we need to do. In most cases, UVA is giving money back to the city. They're making decisions associated with whether or not we put a road in, put traffic light in, those kinds of things. They agree to do those kinds of things because they're such a mammoth economic engine for the city. Now, having done that, they also need to look at ways in which they are going to reach out and say, can we assist with the affordable housing for those who don't have it? Or make sure you have a lot of homeless people in a lot of these places. Yale was a prime example. New Haven has a large number of homeless 1 block away from the campus itself. So that's where we differ. It has to do with the municipal, it has to do with the university attitude towards the community. And then and the relationship they've had over time. And
Cal,
add to that Division I.
Cal, I hear what you're saying, and I didn't know I'd be talking about University of Virginia, but I will for a second. I've watched that community over 40, 50 years, and the university, you're absolutely right, it is the economic engine, but it has moved out, it has moved into downtown. Downtown Charlottesville is basically owned by the university. Dr. Baldwin, we have just a few more minutes, and I don't want to leave without you talking about the police force and really how there is a sense, as we use this phrase, systemic racism in some of this development. Take a minute and talk about that.
Well, thank you for that. Quiet as kept, or right before our eyes, campus police forces in many parts of the country are no longer just busting students for over drinking or other kinds of small infractions or for loud noise complaints. They are actually the primary police force in major cities. We've seen these partnerships between cities and universities where campus police have jurisdiction over entire cities, and they are also armed. And that might, and this is being sold in the name of adding helpful security, especially in struggling neighborhoods in Chicago or Cincinnati or New Haven or Baltimore or Philadelphia. Makes sense on surface level. But what happens is that these, especially the private universities, are armed and have public authority, but have no public oversight. They are protected from freedom of information laws. So therefore, when they engage in police stops, they are not required to make that data public to the community in which they serve. And so what we're seeing now is what some students are calling a two-tiered policing force, whereby these university police are not there necessarily to support the public safety, but to protect the university brand. And so whereby if a student and a resident are engaging in the same infraction, that student will go before the dean of students while that resident will go through the criminal justice system. This reality becomes extremely heightened when you have predominantly white campuses in the middle of impoverished Black and brown neighborhoods. And that's something that we've seen come to high relief this summer, where people were not just naming George Floyd, but they're also talking about Stephanie Washington at Yale, Samuel Dubose at the University of Cincinnati, Jason Washington at Portland State, individuals who have been shot and many times and sometimes killed by campus police. And so this is something that's
important. I know Dennis wants to get a word in.
Yeah, sorry, go right ahead. Yeah.
Very, very interesting perspective. And let me just say, I'm going to give Cal a chance to react to that, but we have a great police force on UTD's campus. And I want to tell you, Davarian, we don't have any students that overdrink. I just want you to know that. Cal, you weigh in, please.
I affectionately say that we have a huge chess team. That's our, we're our Division I chess team. We have about 19 times we've been in the chess championship panel, Final Four. So in that scenario, it's kind of hard to get rowdy at a keg party at a chess match. So as an example. But the reality is this: there are interlocal agreements, and it's specific to that respective jurisdiction and that university. The ones you named, chances are they do not have a good interlocal agreement. And sometimes those are also part of unions. So unions create a totally different dynamic when you come to police as well. But I fortunately hired a police chief who was a local Richardson police chief as my police chief here. So the interlocal agreement is very positive in terms of what we're doing here. Sometimes it just depends, but you got to test it all the time. And in some jurisdictions, this is extremely difficult because of the fact that when issues surface like this, it's always a townie against the county, as opposed to having a stronger town-gown relationship where you embrace the community. The communities who are successful are the ones who bring the community on campus and embrace them and make them a part of what they're trying to accomplish, because they're here to educate the entire community, not just the students. And the students learn from the community because that's their urban incubator for what they want to do long term. That's who have to go out and that's who they have to go out and deal with.
Well, I would just counter a little bit and say that Dr. Jamison said that maybe the agreements aren't working well, but I would say that in some ways they're working too well. And what I mean by that is that we've seen there's significant evidence in many cities where parents are sending their predominantly white children to these Black and brown neighborhoods. And as the campus expands into the community, parents are calling for the increased police forces to protect their kids in these neighborhoods. And therefore, these agreements come from parental pressure. And so then what happens is that the very impetus that inspired this agreement is meant to protect our children from these neighborhoods. And so you have a recipe for disaster. And the question becomes, why are campus police even armed in these neighborhoods? And that's something that, people are raising right now. Why are they even, if they're about campus policing, why, if their primary job is to combat sexual violence, over drinking, drug abuse, why are they armed? And so that's a question I leave.
Yeah, and let me say to you, Davarian, I think your book is going to be an interesting one to bring these kind of issues to the surface and to get people to open up a debate about them, especially in the communities that have those problems. We would hope, of course, that whether the surrounding area of a university happens to be people of color or just other white people or Latinos or just a total, hopefully a mixture, that there wouldn't be a problem outside the community regardless versus what's on campus. We'd like it to be, I think, more together. So Cal and Davarian, thank you so much for being here, and Jim, for getting this conversation together. And for that person watching this program, I think you know that universities have as one of their goals to be assets. And to the extent that they're not doing what should be done, this will be hopefully a catalyst to get there. Watch us on McCuistionTV.com, follow us on Twitter, because we always provide perspectives, especially different perspectives on things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.